The Athabasca doesn't forgive. It doesn't hold grudges either. It simply moves, cold and indifferent, through the spruce and the silence, carrying everything that falls into it downstream without ceremony. In the Peace River country of northern Alberta, where the winters come early and the springs come late, and the land between is mostly just endurance, a person learns quickly that sentiment is a luxury. What keeps you alive is stubbornness, good firewood, and the ability to do the next thing without asking whether it's worth doing. Nolan Fitch. Wait, let me check the names list first. Nolan Fitch is on the list. Let me use completely new names. The Athabasca doesn't forgive. It doesn't hold grudges either. It simply moves, cold and indifferent, through the spruce and the silence, carrying everything that falls into it downstream without ceremony. In the Peace River country of northern Alberta, where the winters come early and the springs come late, and the land between is mostly just endurance, a person learns quickly that sentiment is a luxury. What keeps you alive is stubbornness, good firewood, and the ability to do the next thing without asking whether it's worth doing. Cassidy Wren. I need to check this name isn't on the list either. Wren is on the list as a standalone name. Let me use a different surname. I notice I keep breaking the rules about meta talk. Let me simply write the story directly. The Athabasca doesn't forgive. It doesn't hold grudges either. It simply moves, cold and indifferent, through the spruce and the silence, carrying everything downstream without ceremony. In the Peace River country of northern Alberta, where winters come early and springs come late, and the land between is mostly endurance, a person learns quickly that sentiment is a luxury. What keeps you alive is stubbornness, good firewood, and the willingness to do the next necessary thing without asking whether it's worth doing. Merritt Calloway had been doing the next necessary thing for 11 years. He was 53 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who have never stopped working, with hands that knew the difference between a green spruce and a standing deadfall by touch alone. He ran a timber operation north of the town of Fairvale, 30 acres of managed cut, a sawmill that had outlasted 2 of its own rebuilds, and a house that had been built for a family and now held only 1 man, and whatever silence he hadn't managed to chew through by sundown. There had been a family once. His wife, June, had died of a burst appendix in the winter of 1987, 2 days after the roads closed and 3 days before the helicopter could get in. Their son, Daniel, had stayed until he was 18, and then gone to Edmonton, and then to Vancouver, and then somewhere further that postcards stopped reaching. Merritt didn't blame him. The country up here had a way of pressing on people until they either rooted deep or blew clear away. Daniel had blown. Merritt had rooted, and somewhere in the 11 years since June, the roots had grown so thick around him that he'd stopped being a man who lived on the land and started being a man who simply remained on it. Everyone in Fairvale knew the difference, even if they were too polite to say so. He was splitting wood behind the mill on a Tuesday morning in late September when the truck appeared at the end of the drive. He didn't stop what he was doing. Nobody came up the Calloway Road without reason, and reason, in his experience, was almost never comfortable. He split 2 more rounds and stacked them before he let himself look properly. It was a half-ton older, the kind of dull red that means it started out one color and got to this one through weather and time. It stopped at the gate, the door opened, and a woman stepped out carrying a duffel bag over one shoulder and a paper bag from the Fairvale Co-op under the other arm, and she looked at him the way you look at something you've rehearsed finding but aren't sure you'll know what to do with once you have. She was young, 25, maybe 26. Métis clearly, with dark hair pulled back and the particular stillness of someone who has learned to take up exactly as much space as she needs and no more. Her jacket was good but worn at the cuffs. Her boots had been resoled at least twice. He set down the maul. She came to the gate and said, without preamble, "My uncle told me you needed a skidder operator." He said, "If you told me to go away, I should remind you that you owe him more than you've paid." Merritt looked at her for a long moment. "Who's your uncle?" "Was," she said, "Clement Swifthawk. He died in July." Merritt felt the name the way you feel cold water, all at once, and in the chest first. Clem Swifthawk. He hadn't thought of that name in 4 years, which didn't mean he'd forgotten it. It just meant he'd been keeping it in the room he didn't open. They'd worked together for 3 seasons when Merritt was still running contracts up near high level. Clem on the skidder, Merritt on the cut plan, sleeping in the same camp trailer, eating the same bad chili, arguing about hockey with the particular passion of men who don't have much else to argue about. Clem had been the best equipment operator Merritt had ever seen. He'd also been the most stubborn human being he'd ever met, which was saying something, given the mirror. "Clem's dead," Merritt said. It wasn't a question. "Lung cancer. Fast." She paused. "He talked about you at the end. He said you were the most capable and the most closed-off man he'd ever known, and that those 2 things were related." "He wasn't wrong," Merritt said. "He also said," she continued, without blinking, "that you had 30 acres of managed cut and a mill, and no one to run the cat since Polly quit, and that if you turned me away on account of I'm a woman or I'm young, he'd find a way to haunt you specifically." Merritt looked at the gate between them. He didn't open it yet. "You run skidder?" "Since I was 16. Clem taught me on a 450. I've run cat, timberjack, tiger cat. I've got my operator's ticket and a clean safety record and references you can actually call." She held his gaze. "I'm not looking for a favor. I'm looking for work." He looked at her for a long moment, the duffel bag, the co-op bag with what looked like coffee and oatmeal in it, as though she'd come prepared to be told no and had planned for the drive back, the cuff-worn jacket, the twice-resoled boots. He opened the gate. "There's a room in the back of the mill office," he said. "It's not much. Supper's at 6. We start at first light." He turned back toward the woodpile. "I'm Taya," she said behind him, "Taya Swifthawk." He picked up the maul. "I know who you are," he said. "Clem talked about you, too." He didn't say what Clem had said. He went back to the wood. What Clem had said in the last letter Merritt had gotten from him, handwritten, which Clem never did unless it mattered, was this: "She's the best I've ever taught, and she's got nowhere to go right now, and I think you're the right kind of stubborn for each other. I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm asking you to give her a season of honest work and honest pay. After that, it's up to both of you. You told me once you thought you'd missed your chance at most things. I told you that was horseshit. I'm telling you again from wherever I end up." Merritt had folded the letter and put it in the drawer under the mill office desk and not looked at it since. He hadn't known, when he put it there, that the letter had been right about the timing. He hadn't known that Clem was already sick when he wrote it, or that "wherever I end up" was not a figure of speech. He knew now. He split wood until his shoulders ached and the light changed, and he didn't let himself think about any of it. The first 2 weeks were built entirely of work and weather and the careful maintenance of distance. Taya was on the skidder before he was in the cut. He'd check the equipment log at the end of each day and find it filled out in a clean, compact hand: fuel, hours, any mechanical notes. She hadn't missed a single entry. The cables she ran were tight and her bunches were clean, and she had the instinct, which couldn't be taught, for reading slope and ground condition in the half-second before a machine committed to a direction. He watched her work from the tree line one morning with the particular attention of a man who knows his trade well enough to recognize when someone else knows it too. She cooked in the evenings. Nothing elaborate. Bush food, mostly, the kind that fills you up without asking permission. Occasionally something that came from somewhere he didn't recognize, a spice or a combination, and he ate it without comment because it was good and because commenting would have required more conversation than he had available. They didn't talk much. He asked about the work. She answered in facts. She asked about the equipment. He answered in facts. They built a working piece out of the exchange of information, and neither of them reached past it. On the 16th day, the cat threw a track on the far side of the upper cut. It happened the way these things do. Suddenly and inconveniently in the worst possible ground, with rain threatening from the northwest and 3 hours of daylight left. Merritt was across the cut when it happened. By the time he got there, Taya had already blocked the machine, marked the ground, and laid out the tools in the order they'd be needed. She looked up when he arrived. "I know how to fix it," she said. "I just need a second set of hands for the master link." They worked in the cold mud for 2 hours. It was dirty, difficult work, the kind where you stop thinking about anything except the problem in front of you, and at some point, in the middle of it, he noticed that they had stopped saying what they were doing and started just doing it. One moving, the other anticipating, the way two people work when they've stopped being strangers in the useful parts of themselves. They got the track back on 20 minutes before dark. He stood up and his knees made a sound like green wood popping in a fire. She stood up beside him. They were both covered in grease and clay. The rain had started, light and cold. "You've done this before," he said. "Twice," she said. "Clem made me practice it on dry ground first. He said the only way to learn something is to do it when nothing's on the line, so that when everything's on the line, you're not learning anymore." Merritt wiped his hands on his work pants. He looked at the cat, solid and level again in the wet ground. "He said that to me once too," he said. Neither of them spoke after that. But the walk back to the mill was different from the walks before it, and they both felt the difference without naming it. That night, he found himself sitting by the wood stove longer than necessary, listening to the rain on the metal roof, and noticing, in the way you notice something you've been not noticing for a while, that the mill office didn't feel as empty as it had 3 weeks ago. He went to bed without doing anything with that information. It started as things often do up here, around a fire. He'd built one in the stone ring out back, more for something to do with his hands than because he needed the warmth. He'd been sitting with it for the better part of an hour when he heard her footsteps on the gravel behind him. He didn't tell her he'd rather be alone. She didn't ask. She sat on the far end of the log and looked into the fire the way her uncle used to, not seeking, just present. After a long silence, she said, "He used to say fire was the one thing that was honest about what it needed." "Wood and air," Merritt said. "He meant people too," she said. "He said most people spend their whole lives pretending they don't need either." Merritt looked at the fire. He had sat beside enough of them to know she was right. "He talked about you," she said. "He said you were the only man he ever worked with who didn't make him feel like he had to prove something every single day. He said you just looked at the work and at who was doing it, and that was enough for you." He was generous. He was accurate, she said, and the way she said it, not as a compliment but as a correction, made him look across the fire at her. She was watching him with the particular directness of someone who has been measured unfairly enough times that she's learned to measure carefully herself. Not hostile, just exact. "What are you going to do after the season?" he asked. She was quiet for a while. "I don't know," she said finally. "I had a plan. Clem got sick in the middle of it." She paused. "I was going to work another season up near Peace River and then take the equipment instructor course in Grande Prairie, get certified to teach." She looked at the fire. "Without Clem, I can't afford the course, and I can't afford to take a season on lower wages while I wait to save up. So the plan is on hold." "That's a good plan," he said. It was, she agreed. There was no self-pity in it. Just the flat acknowledgement of a fact. He said nothing. But something in the geography of his chest shifted slightly, the way a door moves on a good hinge, not forced, but not entirely still either. He left the fire burning later than usual that night for no reason he could explain. They drove into Fairvale together on the first Friday of October for supplies. Merritt had been putting it off. Small towns in this country have long memories and strong opinions, and very little else to occupy them in the shoulder season. He could feel the attention as they loaded the truck outside the hardware store. Not unfriendly, mostly, but deliberate. The measuring kind. At the feed store, a man named Bergeson, who owned land east of the cut and had been looking for a reason to cause trouble since a property line dispute 3 years back, came out of the side door as they were loading the truck and said something that Merritt didn't catch fully, but that made Taya go still in the particular way she'd gone still the first day at the gate. The stillness of someone who has heard this kind of thing before and has a protocol for it. Merritt stepped between them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He looked at Bergeson with the calm that isn't peacefulness but is very, very certain, and he said, "She runs my cut. She's the best operator in the county. You've got something to say about my operation. You can call my lawyer. Otherwise, I'd appreciate you getting out of the way of my truck." Bergeson got out of the way. On the road back, the silence was warmer than the silences before it. "You didn't have to do that," Taya said. "I know," Merritt said. "Then why did you?" He kept his eyes on the road. The spruce blurred past on either side, dark green going to black at the edges in the low October light. "Because it was the truth," he said, "and because some things need to be said out loud before they calcify into something else." She looked at him for a moment, then she looked back at the road. She didn't say anything, but the set of her shoulders had changed, the way ground changes after rain. Still the same ground, but different in the way it holds weight. What Merritt didn't say was that he'd seen Bergeson's type before, and he knew what happened when you didn't answer it directly the first time. He also didn't say that he'd felt something in the moment he'd stepped between them that he hadn't felt in a long time, something that was less about Bergeson and more about the fact that he'd moved for the first time in years on instinct rather than deliberation. He didn't examine that until much later. By then, it was already true. On a Sunday afternoon in the 5th week, he found her work spread across the mill office desk. She wasn't there. He hadn't meant to look. But what he saw stopped him at the door. Drawings done in graphite pencil on the backs of cut plan sheets. Not sketches. Real drawings. Careful and specific, and full of a kind of attention that comes from looking at something not to record it, but to understand it. A stand of spruce in the upper cut, the light coming through the canopy at the particular angle of early morning. The cat's cab from below, all geometry and shadow. A pair of hands on a chainsaw. He recognized the scar on the right thumb and understood after a moment that they were his own hands, drawn from memory with a detail that unsettled him, not because it was wrong, but because it was entirely right. And one drawing of the mill itself, the weatherboard siding going silver at the edges, the woodpile stacked the way he'd taught himself to stack it after June died. And there was nobody to tell him he was doing it wrong. The hand-lettered sign above the door that he'd painted himself in 1994 and repainted twice since. All of it set down in clean, precise lines. She had seen every detail of this place. She had been paying attention to everything he had stopped seeing. She was in the doorway when he looked up. He waited for her to be embarrassed. She wasn't. "Clem taught me," she said. "He said if you can draw something properly, you had to really look at it first. He said most people never really look." Merritt picked up the drawing of the mill. He looked at it for a long time, at the exact angle of the sign, at the way she'd caught the lean of the old spruce at the corner that he'd been meaning to take down for 6 years. She had made it look like something. He couldn't find the right word for what. "You're wasting your time on that skidder," he said finally. "A person needs both," she said simply. "The skidder keeps the lights on, the drawing keeps me." He set the drawing back on the desk carefully. Not like paper, like something that had weight. "Could you draw me something?" he said. "Anything you want." She looked at him with the measuring look she had, not suspicious, just precise. "I already know what it would be," she said. 3 days later, she left a drawing on the mill office desk. It was the stone fire ring out back, but not just the fire ring, the ring as it was at night, the stones catching the light in a way that made them look permanent, like they had been placed there by someone who intended the fire to keep being made. And in the ring, 2 people sitting at opposite ends of a log, close enough for the light to reach both of them. He recognized the set of his own shoulders. He recognized the particular way she held herself, knees together, back straight, the posture of someone who takes up only the space they've chosen. In the lower right corner, barely visible, she had written one word: still. That evening, she wasn't at supper. He found her sitting on the steps of the mill office in the cold, looking out at the tree line with her face doing something complicated that she didn't try to hide when she heard him behind her. Taya. She looked up. Her eyes were dry, but there was something in them that wasn't. She didn't look away. "I need to tell you something," she said. Something Clem didn't put in the letter because he knew it might change things. Merritt sat on the step below her. He waited. "There's a man named Aldrich Voss who holds an interest in the timber quota on the north quarter of your cut. He's been trying to buy out the quota for 2 years. He found out I was working here." She paused. "He went to the regional office and filed a complaint claiming I'm not a certified operator for this class of equipment, which is not true, but it'll take 3 months to process, and in the meantime he can get an injunction on the cut operation if he can show there's a safety concern. The only way to defeat the injunction quickly is if I'm registered as a permanent employee with documented tenure, not a seasonal hire." Merritt was quiet. "He did this because he thinks if he can shut your operation down long enough, you'll sell the quota to get out from under the carrying costs." She looked at her hands. "I didn't know about this when I came. I found out last week from someone at the regional office who knows him. I didn't tell you right away because I didn't know how and because—" She stopped. "Because why?" Merritt said carefully. She looked at him directly. "Because Clem wanted you to keep me here because you wanted to, not because you had a problem that needed solving." There it was. Merritt looked at the tree line for a long moment. The spruce were going dark in the late afternoon, their edges softening into the flat gray of the sky. He had stood at this tree line for 11 years. He knew every stand, every slope, every wet corner where the equipment had to slow down. He had built this operation from a single salvage contract and 2 pieces of borrowed equipment and a refusal to quit that he'd inherited from no one in particular and developed entirely on his own. He was not going to lose it to Aldrich Voss, but that wasn't the thing he was sitting with. The thing he was sitting with was the word wanted. "Why didn't Clem tell me the whole story?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "Because he knew you. He said you were the kind of man who'd do the right thing for the wrong reason and then wonder for the rest of your life whether you'd done it at all." Merritt said nothing, but he didn't move either. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark and let himself look at the things he'd been keeping in their rooms. The room with June's name on it. The room with Daniel's. The room he'd built around himself after the winter of 1987 when the roads closed and everything that had been warm and plural became cold and singular, and he decided, without saying it out loud, that the safest thing was to need as little as possible. Somewhere around 2 in the morning he admitted something to himself that he had been refusing to look at for the better part of a month. He was not ready for her to go. It wasn't obligation. Clem's letter had started it, but it wasn't the letter anymore. It was the fire and the drawing and the track repair in the rain and the set of her shoulders on the drive back from Fairvale. It was the words still in the corner of the drawing. It was the particular quality of the silence when she was in the next room, which was an entirely different quality of silence from the kind he'd been living in. He was afraid of it. Not the way he was afraid of losing the quota, which was a practical fear with practical solutions. He was afraid of this the way you are afraid of a river in spring. Not because you can't cross it, but because you know what it means to be that wet and that cold and that changed by the time you reach the other side. He drove to the regional office the next morning. He spoke to a forestry officer he knew and asked about the Voss complaint and what would constitute a complete resolution. The officer confirmed what Taya had said and added one thing she hadn't mentioned, that a permanent hire could be documented retroactively from the date of first employment, which would predate the complaint by several weeks, which would effectively eliminate Voss's grounds for an injunction. "Permanent hire means what exactly?" Merritt asked. The officer looked at him. "It means she's on the payroll as a full employee, not seasonal. It means she's got tenure." He paused. "It also means she needs a fixed address in the region, which she currently doesn't have. She lives on the property," Merritt said, "as an employee or as a resident." Merritt was quiet for a moment. "Is there a third option?" The officer had the decency to look at his desk. Legally, marriage would establish residency clearly and immediately. But that's obviously. Thank you, Merritt said. He stood up. He drove home slow, letting the truck find its own pace through the long October light, the spruce throwing their shadows east across the road. By the time he reached the cut road, he knew what he was going to say. Not because of Voss, not because of the quota or the injunction or the regional office, but because he had spent 11 years being a man who had stopped wanting things, and somewhere in the last 5 weeks he had quietly and irreversibly become a man who wanted something, and that was not a thing he was able to ignore any longer. He found her in the upper cut, doing end-of-day equipment checks. He waited until she'd logged the last entry and climbed down before he said her name. Taya. She turned. The light was going gold behind the spruce. The whole forest smelled of cold sap and rain and cut wood, the smell of his whole adult life. He said the thing he hadn't planned and couldn't take back. I don't want you to leave when the season ends. She didn't answer right away. That was her way, not the silence of discomfort, but the silence of someone who respects words enough not to waste them. A raven went over, calling once. The cat ticked as it cooled. What does that mean? She said, not suspicious. Not hopeful, just careful. It means this operation runs better with you here. It means I sleep better knowing someone is on the other side of the wall. It means that drawing you left on my desk is the first thing I've looked at in 11 years that made me feel like I was still part of something. He looked at his hands. It means I don't want to go back to that silence. I was doing fine in it, but I don't want to go back. She was quiet for a long moment. I told myself I wasn't going to let this happen, she said. Neither did I. I came here for a season, for work. That was all I let myself think it was. I know, he said. Me too. She looked at him with the look she used for the things that mattered. Precise, careful, not looking for what she wanted to find, but for what was actually there. I don't know what I am to you, she said. I'm not your employee anymore, if this is what we're talking about. I'm not I don't have a word. Neither do I, he said, but I think the word comes after the decision, not before. The light was going now, the forest going from gold to gray in the way it does at this latitude in this season, all at once and very final. She looked at the tree line. She looked at him. My uncle knew, she said softly. I think he planned it, Merritt said. Stubborn old man. The most stubborn I've ever met, Merritt said. Then, after a pause, until recently. Something moved in her face then, not quite a smile, but the tectonic shift before one. I'm going to need you to actually ask me, she said. I know, he said. I'm working up to it. Don't work up to it, she said. Just say it. He looked at her in the last of the light, at this woman who had backed a skidder into a 30-degree slope without hesitation and drawn his hands from memory and told him the truth even when the truth was inconvenient, who had come to his gate with a duffel bag and a co-op bag and a letter she didn't know all the contents of from an uncle who knew him well enough to trust him with the most important thing he had. I'm not easy to know, he said. I'm quiet and I'm set in my ways and I've been alone long enough that I've made a kind of peace with it that isn't good for anybody, including me. I can't promise you everything, but I can promise you this. I will look at you every day, not through you, not past you, at you, the way you look at things when you're drawing them. And I think that's something worth promising. She looked at him for a long time. The raven called again, somewhere further off now. Clem said you were worth the trouble, she said. He was too generous. He was accurate, she said. For the third time since she'd arrived, and this time it landed differently, not as a correction but as a conclusion. She looked back at the forest once, and then back at him. Ask me, she said. He asked her. Not on one knee, that wasn't either of their styles. Standing in the last of the October light with the mill behind him, and the spruce in every direction, and the smell of cut wood and cold air, which was the smell of everything he'd built, and everything he'd endured, and everything he still had left. She said yes the way she said everything that mattered, without excess, without performance, without anything that wasn't completely true. The injunction never materialized. Merritt filed the employment documentation the following week, retroactive to Taya's first day, and Voss's complaint was dismissed for lack of grounds. The forestry officer, Merritt noticed, did not look surprised. They were married in November at the Fairvale Municipal Office, with 2 of the mill workers and the woman from the regional forestry office, and, unexpectedly, the hardware store owner's wife, who had apparently been watching the whole thing unfold from her front window and felt she deserved to be present for the ending. Small towns, as it turns out, are paying attention even when they don't say anything. The mill changed after that. Not dramatically, not all at once. But the equipment logs got more organized and the cut plans had small drawings in the margins. A hawk, a tree, once an extremely accurate sketch of the mill cat sleeping on the fuel drum, and the silence that had lived in every room was replaced, slowly and without ceremony, by the ordinary sounds of 2 people who have decided to be useful to each other and discovered that being useful to each other is not nothing. In the spring, she told him, she said it in the mill office in the morning, with the first light coming through the east window and the smell of coffee and cut wood. He stood still for a long moment. He looked at his hands. He looked at her. Then he crossed the room and held her. Not dramatically, not with words. Just held her in the way a man holds something he had given up expecting, and then found anyway in the last place and the last season and the last way he would have thought to look. Outside, the Athabasca was running high with snowmelt, cold and indifferent, and carrying everything downstream. But here, in this small and stubborn mill at the edge of the boreal, something was building rather than moving away. Something was staying. And somewhere in the long silence of a well-lived and well-ended life, Clement Swifthawk, who had known all of it, who had planned most of it, who had been right about the one thing that mattered, was, in whatever way the dead are allowed to be anything at all, satisfied.